contestable discussions, agreeing when we can, and fervently disagreeing when we can't. So I'm hoping that that's what today's session is about. I'm super excited to be able to introduce you to three amazing people. So I'm going to start with Ben Day. Ben is a lecturer in the Department of International Relations at ANU. Now, Ben's research really explores the role of leaders in foreign policy decision-making, and he does lots of research in relation to aid and political decisions around aid. Whilst Ben's research does focus on the dynamics of foreign aid, in fact, his current project is called Time to Think, with a big question mark, Leaders and World Order. So he's up here to explore the source of leaders' visions of order and respond to the provocation we're going to hear. The second person I'm going to introduce is Jacqui de Lacy. I know known to many of you, of course, Jacqui is one of the most committed development professionals who has had experience both in government, not-for-profit, multilateral and commercial entities. Jacqui is currently the Chief Global Development Officer at APT Global, and her portfolio spans over 50 countries with a focus in particular on improving health outcomes, climate mitigation and adaptation. Now, she's a long-standing director of the board at UNICEF Australia. She's just joined the board of e-water as well. And prior to joining APT, you may have known Jacqui, given she spent 23 years working for AusAid and DFAT. Now, Richard actually refers to Jacqui as a former colleague. Jacqui reminds him regularly that he was one of the most demanding bosses she has ever had. So that leads me to longtime collaborator and friend Richard Moore. Now, Richard Moore is a strategic analyst specialising in Southeast Asian development. He's undertaken strategic reviews for DFAT, the Asian Development Bank and the UN, and of course, who could forget the fact that he launched his review of DFAT AusAid integration at this conference a number of years ago as well. He's a strategic advisor with us at the Development Intelligence Lab, and we're lucky to have him. But of course, prior to all of that, Richard was actually Deputy Director General for Asia at AusAid, and he was also an Asian Development Bank board member 2004 to 2007. So I think all these three people deserve an extraordinary introduction. They are leaders in their field, and I'm lucky to call many of them friends, colleagues and collaborators. So please introduce them and welcome them. So what are we in for today? This is not your regular panel discussion. In fact, what we are going to hear is a 30-year retrospective from Richard. He is constantly and incessantly trying to make sense of the world as he sees it and the role of Australian development in it. You have it from me, he is categorically allergic to the status quo when the status quo is not working. So I think you'll be in for a treat. So we're going to hear from Richard, and then we're actually going to turn to Ben and Jacqui and put you on the spot and ask you, what are you hearing that resonates from what Richard said, what's not, how are you thinking differently about the world as we know it? And then we will engage in a Q&A with the audience. So welcome, Richard, the end of a development era. Over to you.
Good afternoon. Yesterday somebody said to me, we're having a very nice conference. Everybody's agreeing with each other. It's very polite, it's very nice. Well, that ends now. I am too old to be cautious and polite. I actually need to risk being crude, rude and booed. And so I'm going to say a few things that you'll probably disagree with. Ultimately, my argument is that we don't have nearly enough debate about foreign policy fundamentals in Australia, with a lot of issues off limits and debate managed by a few high priests. I want to encourage everyone in the room to contribute to changing that, because the issues that we're discussing are fundamental to the health, wealth and welfare of all Australians. In a nutshell, my argument today is that the world is changing rapidly and radically, and we're not keeping up. We're not managing the risks, we're not taking the opportunities, we're not shaping institutions, policies, and events to deliver the most positive outcomes. This is, in my view, a story of governance failure, not in Moresby, not in Manila, but in London, Washington, and Canberra, amongst other places. There's still time to put things right, in my view, but not much. If a middle power like Australia can't get its act together, there isn't great hope that we're going to get through the next period, which is clearly going to involve a fraying of international order, and that's an understatement. Now, some of you, I didn't read the synopses for this conference until last night, and I got a shock, because I got to Masood's session, and it sounded quite like this one. And I was both pleased and a little bit concerned, and my concern grew slightly at the beginning of Masood's presentation. And you're going to find there's about 24 touch points. But there's also enough difference that I don't think you're going to be bored, and hopefully some big issues and points are going to be reinforced. Let's see. I'm going to have to edit a little bit as I go so that I don't reproduce the first quarter of Masood's presentation. But I would note this, and I'm going to leave this behind. That's the way I was going to start. I had 4 key facts that I was going to lead in with. And guess what? They match your 4 key points almost identically. And clearly that underlines our message that we have just lived through the greatest improvement in human history. And that has been phenomenal, but you can't realistically expect that it's going to continue. The progress that's been made has been so advantageous to Australia, we've forgotten just how good it's been in terms of our security, in terms of our prosperity. We've been able to ride on the back of the development of East Asia. We've had a very good 30 years. The world's had a very good 70 years. We've had an exceptionally good 30 years, and we've forgotten just what's underpinning that. It isn't just down to our own hard work and good luck. Now, I'm not going to run through all of these, but a whole lot of things went right to contribute to this period of very fast growth. And the growth, in turn, was translated into development, and there are all sorts of contributions to that played a role, not least the development of international institutions, norms, and standards that have fitfully improved governance and allowed us to expand cooperation across multiple dimensions, commercial, development, and many others. But, as we heard earlier, there are a lot of storm clouds. Again, I'm not going to go through these individually. The 3 that Masood emphasised are certainly on my list, some others as well. And I would, in particular, I would point to the return of economic nationalism as being deeply, deeply worrying. The Trump tariffs, should they come to pass, are certainly going to exacerbate this fragmentation that is going to undermine economic cooperation, and that's going to make everybody a lot poorer. There's been a bit of talk at the conference about AI. Clearly, lots of opportunity in AI, but I tell you what, if you're a small country, if you're a weak capacity country, it's going to be a pretty tough environment to squeeze the opportunities out of what's coming, and there's a lot of threat in there as well. China is already under a prolonged economic slowdown, and that's partly demographic, it's partly the result of misplaced public investment, That's going to weigh on global growth for a long time. But even if we didn't have these and the headwinds that were mentioned earlier, the successful countries of the last 30 years are predominantly now in a period where development gets a whole lot more complex and difficult. And squeezing high growth out of it is much harder. So I think when you throw that into the mix as well, there's no doubt that the global economy is going to be proceeding more slowly over the next 20 years, and we've got obviously geopolitical and other complications in the mix as well. Sometimes it seems like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have become the 44 horsemen of the apocalypse. But you know, obviously we shouldn't get too despondent about things. We make the future as well as live in it. My central contention is, though, that the progress of the last 70 years was an aberration. It will not be repeated unless we consciously engineer the circumstances that give rise to it. And even if we do, it's going to get harder from here. So then the question is, how do we respond to this situation? It's been summed up by the World Bank Vice President, Gill, earlier this year as a wretched milestone, the weakest global growth performance of any half-decade since the 1990s. So that's just underlining that things are pretty bad. For Australia, significantly lower growth in East Asia or conflict-affected trade, it would cut our international earnings dramatically and undermine our balance of payments. It would cause significant unemployment and substantially reduced living standards. So the decline in our strategic circumstances is real. It may have a long way to run yet, and it requires a strong and determined defence posture for sure. But few of the problems on the list can be solved with gunboats, or at least gunboats alone. And so the argument is that we're not working intensively enough across a range of these international challenges, and I'm going to speak to that as we go. This has been the conclusion that's come out of Lowy, has come out of DevPol, has come out of AP4D, that we really need to lift our game. That's partly, but not only, a function of funding, of diplomacy and development. And there's been a intensifying consensus around this over the last decade. The big question for us is, why have successive Australian governments remained so resistant to that conclusion? I don't have a full and final answer to that, but I'm going to have a go at answering it from my perspective. I think that across the Anglosphere especially, socio-economic and foreign policy are now badly mismatched to our changed circumstances because our governance has become so degraded and captured that we're unable to get the diagnostics right and we're unable to get the responses right. Earlier, Masood touched briefly on our economic model. And I'm going to elaborate a bit because I think this has become part of the problem. And we both go back to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that really was such a powerful moment. And yes, we laughed at Fukuyama for the end of history faux pas, but then we went about policy as if it was the end of history. And I think all development partners, they project their views and values, but since the fall of the Berlin Wall, really, we've succumbed to hubris. So the great triumph was that markets were proved to be more effective in many cases at facilitating the improvement in human welfare. But we took that to the nth degree. So central planning out, markets in, made good sense. But small states and low tax were adopted as ends in themselves. I remember when Donald Trump launched his 2018 tax cuts, the next day the usually sensible Malcolm Turnbull said, well, we better follow. Rather than thinking about, well, what's taxation for? It's for the sort of society you want to build. You want to build that society? That's what you want? We're not asking the question in the right way. Deregulation, which is sensible in many respects, but it became a fetish. We know that trade boosts growth. Why not buy gas from Putin? Why not buy surveillance tech from China? Why not lease your ports to your adversaries? And freeing up the banks, again, a great idea to get finance through to the private sector, allow further growth. But in the process, we've gone too far, and we've facilitated merchant banks and private financiers taking over whole swathes of economic and social activity. Financialization of housing, sports, entertainment, universities. So my thesis is that in our unipolar moment, we lost the plot. I think we've had three big claims that we've been able to ride on the last 30 years. And the first one has been, well, we're developed. We know what this is about. Just be quiet and we'll tell you about it if you're lucky. Then we've tended to say, well, the guys who picked up our recipe, the guys in East Asia, they're doing really well. So, just follow them. And by the way, the other guys, the Soviets, well, they failed, just saying. And that sort of logic was able to, essentially to be a very powerful bolstering of our economic and political model. The truth is that claim number two was always overstated the extent to which East Asian countries copied the Washington Consensus. And as they become richer, they're increasingly making their own judgments about the right role for the state and political governance. And while people my age might remember why the Soviet Union collapsed and what a dead-end, highly concentrated command and control regimes are, this is pretty much washed out of the system for most people. And that throws a huge weight back on the performance of the Western model as a template for development. Now, I'm arguing that in its most powerful exemplar, the United States, the US is now producing negative development, not across the board, but across multiple indices. 5 years ago, a journalist whom I greatly admire, Martin Wolf, who's a good economist and a very moderate and reasonable guy, he wrote a scathing article that said something has gone very wrong. He pointed to the unholy trinity of slowing productivity growth, soaring inequality, huge financial shocks. The inequality data alone is an indictment of the system. If you look at the US, according to the US Economic Policy Institute, CEO pay is now 350 times worker pay, and it has risen by 1,300% since 1978. That's obviously incentivized a few billionaires. US real wages, on the other hand, have been static for 30 years. Lower skilled workers have been going backwards. This is not a system that is performing for everybody. It's no wonder people are angry. Life expectancy has been trending down, even pre-COVID, trending down. Height is declining in several cohorts. That's extraordinary. That's the first time in 200 years. Back in Australia, some similar, not nearly as pronounced trends. The richest 200 increased their share of GDP from 8% 20 years ago to 25%. The Actuaries Institute shows that their research shows the profit share has doubled since the 1970s, and the Gini coefficient is at the highest since World War II. I think we're not asking the question, we're all aware of these stats, but it's kept in peripheral vision. It's never brought front and center. We're not confronting it, except in very piecemeal ways. How did we get here? Nobel laureates Robinson and Acemoglu, authors of Why Nations Fail, argue that development requires a balance between a range of forces, and it's very prone to imbalance. They call the development pathway the narrow corridor. Now, in particular, Acemoglu and Robinson point to the tendency towards government to be too big and oppressive, or too weak and ineffective at controlling vested interests. My contention is that English-speaking countries are now in or headed towards the second category of weak, ineffective governments, entirely ill-equipped to contend with the new robber barons from Silicon Valley. The UK and the US are in much deeper trouble than Australia. Greater polarisation, greater corruption of institutions. Ordinary citizens see this decay, and they wonder why it's not being fixed, and they get angry with the system. Their anger is channeled against foreigners, predominantly, who are the scapegoats. What's happened to produce this? I think there are three big reasons. One of which is that our foreign policy, our economic policy got frozen in time. We haven't been updating it. We haven't been calibrating it according to performance. I think also that our politics has got less grounded in citizens' experience, less evidence-based, more ideological. And again, calibration is compromised by that. And that vested interests have got very, very clever, along with political parties, at behaving in ways that reinforce each other. And this is true of the centre-left and centre-right. I think this last point is the most consequential. Departments and institutions of state have been hollowed out in the name of small government, and they're not allowed these days to, well, many are unable to lead serious policy development or resist governments that are determined to implement poor public policy. They've often become factories for talking points, speeches, and announceables. Now, in Australia, we've got quite a lot of policy right, entrenching universal health care, superannuation, family support, and several aspects of our institutional structure are world-class. Our preferential voting system, the AAC as a guardian of elections. We've got the Productivity Commission that's been able to enhance competition, and we've got the ACCC, the Consumer Commission, which has, again, been able to play an important role. There are many good things about Australia, but we've made some mistakes. This is my list of what I regard as some of the biggest mistakes. Secretaries no longer have enough authority to push back against the executive. We've seen the evolution of an unaccountable ministerial advisor class, of which I was a member once. We've had never-ending efficiency dividends hollowing out departments. And we've had the selling of ministerial access to raised party funds, and also the exemption of parties from advertising and misinformation laws. I think those are a range of governance problems that need to be addressed in the near future. Now, not surprisingly, given failure to address some of the biggest challenges and decay of the system itself, trust in government and business has never been lower, according to the University of New South Wales. Now, unfortunately, the rest of the world looks at the West and sees chaos. It sees division and disunity and inability to resolve problems. That's overstated for sure, because a lot of government goes on regardless. But in terms of global optics, that's what's visible. And that means that the persuasive power of our model of liberal democracy has declined significantly. Yesterday, Michelle Higlin showed us a map about democracy in the region and how it was in retreat. This is one of the reasons why poor democratic performance is a particular problem. I'm going to refer specifically to us as an international citizen, and I'm going to pose a question that was posed to someone years ago by an Indonesian minister who said, what happened to Australia? And the upshot of the question was, when did we become less active internationally, less engaged in Southeast Asia, less willing and able to cooperate on big issues? Once upon a time, we were a global problem solver, reconstructing Cambodia, pushing for reform of world agricultural markets, pioneering harm reduction with HIV, at the forefront of joining up the Mekong, developing the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, shepherding East Timor independence. Those are the sorts of actions of a very active, creative middle power. The problem with the list is it thins out as you get near the present day. And so the great international relations idea of the Morrison government was AUKUS. And the great international relations idea of the Albanese government is AUKUS. This is less fear of abandonment than fear of being wedged and not having an alternative to sell. Interestingly, Richard Dennis, CEO of the Australia Institute, says he does not know a single Labor MP who is pro-AUKUS in private. And yet, we have locked in ever more tightly and expensively to US foreign and defence policy for decades to come without a national conversation, let alone a national consensus. And we've done this at the very time the US is becoming less reliable. Now, I've got many reservations about AUKUS, but I'm not qualified to say whether it's a good security policy. But even if it is, it's sucking the money, expertise, and energy out of the rest of foreign policy because we haven't deliberately counterbalanced this intensely military-dominated international relations strategy. Sir Angus Houston recently said it's even unbalancing defence policy. For a rules-based order to endure, it must enjoy the support, the consent of the majority, but also their support. It must be continuously renovated and reformed. The current system, I would argue, is in serious disrepair, and Australia is not doing nearly enough to maintain and renovate it. It's overly focused on security and liberal economics, overly stacked with Western interests, underfunded, and ignored when it suits us. We know the ODA story. It's no surprise to us. It's more of a surprise to see that most of the rest of the world has gone in the opposite direction, although, as we heard earlier, you can't take all of these numbers at face value. Nevertheless, other countries, our peers, are seeing a growing use for ODA, and we're headed in the opposite direction. It's not just Southeast Asia where we're seriously undercooked. Our global presence and influence has shrunk just at the time we should be stepping up as a middle power. The multilateral system, it may well be cumbersome, inefficient, and in need of reform, but it's also essential to resolving collective problems. Research by Cam Hill from DevPol has highlighted the decline in Australia's multilateral resourcing, squeezed by a tight ODA budget and understandable bilateral emphasis on Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Worse still, the OECD breakdown of our multilateral funding shows a halving of core contributions as a proportion of total spending. We robbed Southeast Asia to shore up the Pacific. Now we're robbing the multilaterals to shore up Southeast Asia. There's a message there that really we need to lift our game across the board. It's not just that Australia's position, voice and reputation have declined, it's that we're starving the system. I want to look at 4 areas where that's the case, very, very quickly. Climate change. The previous government was passive-aggressive on climate change. Things have improved. The current government is just passive. Yes, we are back in the Green Climate Fund. Yes, climate change is a priority of the development policy. We're creating new, albeit modest, financing instruments. As Terence reminded us yesterday, there's not much sign of new and additional money yet, and that's going to be a real crunch. But simultaneously, we're opening new gas wells, we're prolonging coal mine leases, and so it's not surprising that despite the Fulapili deal, Tuvalu and other Pacific Island countries are speaking out strongly against Australian policy. The Centre for Global Development has recently released a climate change scorecard, and not surprisingly, Australia ranks 19 out of 22 advanced countries. As the Australia Institute recently explained, our emissions per head have hardly changed in 25 years. We're right at the top of the pile as one of the worst emitters, and the Climate Change Authority, our domestic agency, confirmed that just last week. Health security. The world was very lucky that COVID was a pretty mild pandemic. A bit of a wake-up call for what could be around the corner. Twice as lethal, a couple of times more transmissible, and we probably would have faced severe social and economic breakdown. Have we learned the lessons? Have we embarked on a concerted long-term effort to build much stronger health security? Little sign of it. This year, Australia's international expenditure as a percentage of ODA, our health expenditure, will be about half what it was in 2021. DevPol reported recently that our Ambassador for Global Health has said that governments want to move on, which of course they do. But the factors that delivered COVID, encroachment on animal habitats, globalization, climate change, make future pandemics more likely. And with climate change, we're choosing to underweight the science and downplay the risks. People movement. Immigration in all its forms is the most toxic issue of our times. Refugees, asylum seekers, legal migrants, illegal migrants. The UK, US, Europe, and even Australia, we've faced convulsive political backlashes over migration. Now, this you would think would be a powerful incentive to create much stronger systemic responses, especially to forestall major people movements. But countries have oscillated between being overwhelmed, like Germany was in 2015, and adopting draconian measures, as both the US and Australia have done. Neither is a sustainable long-term solution. Now, it's true that 38 OECD countries cannot solve all of the people movement problems, and cannot accommodate all of the people with asylum and refugee claims. The biggest risk is that in failing to sort out the problem, it's disguised through punitive measures and purposefully delayed processing. And this devalues the whole basis of protection, much of which was put in place as a result of the Holocaust. This is a betrayal of the past and our experience as human beings, and never again. Human rights. Comprehensive human rights protection is a very modern phenomenon. In the life of my grandfather, massacres of Indigenous people happened in the US and Australia, amongst other countries, and elicited very anemic responses. There are major human rights challenges today at home and abroad. Our record on Indigenous health, welfare, incarceration, and voice make our international position difficult, and they represent serious unfinished business. Internationally, one of the biggest human rights crises right now is the protection of the rights of women, children, and non-combatants in Gaza. War is ugly. There's always collateral damage. Women and children always bear the brunt. But there are rules and obligations, and a cowardly, vicious, and abhorrent attack creates the right of a forceful response. It creates the right of self-defense, but not the right to do anything. Actions that are non-negotiable include denying the human rights of civilians, purposefully displacing and dehumanizing them. It includes targeting civilian infrastructure such as hospitals, water and food supplies. It includes rape and the assassination of journalists, healthcare workers, academics and legal practitioners. Australia has not been sufficiently robust in asserting these standards. When credible expert witnesses such as Jan Egeland and Chris Sidoti and Médecins Sans Frontières raise major concerns, we are duty-bound to listen. Very few of our leaders have spoken up strongly and consistently, and several have downplayed and dismissed Gazan human rights. Internationally, that brings us into disrepute, but more importantly, it weakens the entire system, the entire human rights regime that we purport to defend. Rules-based order emerged not only through a military-enforced Pax Americana, but through a system of intensive international cooperation that amounted to a global social contract. When middle powers like Australia step back from this contract, it's weakened, and so too the whole commitment to global order, especially on a Western template. Consequently, we're seeing the rise of determined challengers who are more able to recruit others to alternative, less benign structures and agendas. Where do we go from here? Well, to recap, I'm arguing the halcyon days of international development are over. That's bad news for Australia, the region, and the globe. I'm arguing that our current development recipe is wrong for us and others, and that we've made a big mistake by downgrading pursuit of development as a global public good. And even more crucially, I'm arguing that our flawed, degraded, and compromised systems of policy development have led us to this place. Last year, Ben and Thomas Wells brought us a paper, a very good piece of research that provided feedback from Australian politicians who'd been on the Save the Children program to acquaint themselves with our development efforts overseas. You might have expected that those people would be amongst the best briefed and most positive about international development. But the feedback to us was that there was no appetite to do more. There was no argument that could be won. We really needed to keep our heads down, and this was as good as it gets. Well, one response is to accept that logic. Another is to utterly reject it and the policy frameworks that go with it. Rather than acquiescing in the closure of space to pursue development, we should challenge the binding constraints that trap us in this position. The first order of business, to my mind, is to cut the Gordian knots we've tied ourselves in. Incremental tinkering will not be enough. This means working on broader agendas than just our own. And Masood made this point in regard to other forms of cooperation and international work. I want to make the same point in regard to domestic work, because I think we must get our own houses in order if we're going to make progress across the globe. Better policy can only be sustained as part of a reformed international relations approach that makes national security subservient to foreign policy rather than vice versa. We need to look at the world differently, including its emerging multipolar character, which argues against aligning with just the biggest power. Likewise, economic policy needs substantial reform and needs to be repositioned as a set of tools for creating the society that we want, rather than the determinant of all other policy. There isn't time to go through them, but it won't surprise you that the reforms that I think are essential for us to make progress include protecting and strengthening democratic governance, especially integrity institutions, revamping socio-economic policy to elevate equity and opportunity. I'd love to see an equity commission to match the productivity commission. I think we have to break the stranglehold of national security on Australia's international relations policy. It's important, but not to the detriment of everything else. And I personally am happy to advocate a move away from AUKUS. I think we need to recommit to constructivist middle power foreign policy that is very focused on this region and a bit less focused on our great and powerful friends. And in the development space, there's a whole load of things that I would put on the table, and you would have a whole load of other ideas as well. And in fact, we've been putting forward proposals for as long as I can remember. There's no shortage of good ideas about how to improve our development. There's a shortage of appetite to pick them up, and we won't be able to deal with that until we can renovate our broader foreign policy. So, I want to end on a happy note. The upside of a Trump victory is that a growing number of Australians are questioning whether Australia and US interests and values are invariably the same. whether the US is a reliable security partner who will inevitably defend us if ever required, whether a war with the country that takes 40% of our exports is inevitable and desirable, and heresy of heresies, whether US primacy in East Asia is an essential Australian national interest goal worth risking nuclear war to maintain. In 2025, I think these things are going to be debated inside political parties, on the floor of the Parliament, and in dining rooms, pubs and clubs, and that is long overdue. Citizens need to involve themselves in these debates and not allow these decisions to be made by a very, very small number of unrepresentative individuals who've been in positions sometimes for decades. Finally, the space is going to open up, I hope, next year, perhaps only a little and for a short time, to recognise what we have studiously avoided for a couple of decades, or that the development of Southeast Asia and the Pacific is a core Australian national interest that we have neglected. And I would urge you to be ready, willing and able to engage actively in those debates. Thank you.
Well, there are very few speakers who manage to get gasps and grabs of seats, a chuckle along the way, and a little bit of a creeping back from the confronting news up there on the stage there, Richard. But I want to turn to Ben and Jacqui. Ben, to me, it felt as though what Richard's provocation was doing was both being confronting. It also had some uncomfortable moments in it, but there was also a pretty significant call not just to action but to have a darn good look at ourselves. So I want to start with the question for both of you: what resonated, before I come back round and ask you what was most quizzical? So what resonated for you, Ben?
Yeah, so plenty of things resonated, and just before I do start, thanks Richard for continually opening up and prying open the space for us to have conversations like this. I think that's almost the most important part of this session, so please look forward to everyone's engagement shortly. But for me, what resonated was we've had this theme, Richard's saying that it's a 70-year period where sort of things were too good. And then earlier today, a 20-year period where things were too good. I think that's too broad, and my reflection was like, I think we're stuck in the 90s. And one thing that brought it home to me was my reaction to Trump's election win, and trying to think through, personally, what that means. And I sort of was trying to chart my reaction, and the way I summarised it was, I wasn't surprised, but I was shocked. And it kind of doesn't make sense. And so I was reading not too long ago, after having a read of Richard's paper, Adam Too's writing about Bidenomics, and his comment was, just an off-the-hand comment, he said, Obama was enough a man of the 90s to believe that crisis was temporary and normality was just that, the norm, it would return. And it sort of hit me, I was like, oh, that's exactly my reaction here. And my sense, I think to riff on Richard's theme that Trump, his return might be a good thing, I think what it invariably does is it means you can't interpret Trump as a blip anymore. It means he's the dominant figure in American politics, if not global politics, for 12 years now. And, it is a new world. Now, on that, let me read a quote from the eminent historian Fritz Stern. He talks about the post-war era being over. Gone too are the simple, perhaps dangerously simple, certainties that went with it. And I think that's right, but it's kind of a boilerplate quote that you hear all around the place, right? The different thing about this quote is that it was from 1972. So the point is that, the sky's been falling in for a long time, and there's been periodic moments of what are we going to do and when is order shifting. Now, I think there's a whole range of arguments you can make to say why the order is shifting. But I would probably move away from Fritz Stern and go with our own Doc Evatt. In 1947, he said that the nations were hovering between two existences. The old order is dead, while the future order is powerless to be born. And I think that's probably as positive as I can be today, in the sense that, you know, there is still a chance for agency here, right? Like there is a period of flux and change, but just to again, we've heard Francis Fukuyama being invoked numerous times today. The end of history. We all like to malign that idea and that phrase, particularly in my international relations discipline. There's a mandatory chuckle after you mention Fukuyama, even though he's written the most cited article in the history of the planet, basically. But I think we all know it's kind of not true. But I think, at least for me, it's in our bones. Like I honestly think that notion is in our bones, and it actually impacts our behaviour, if not our thoughts, as consciously as we might think. And so I think, you know, another way to put it might be the mid-90s have colonised the development brain. We're only just beginning to realise it. It is hubris, as you were saying, Richard. I think Nirvana is still playing. Now, what culturally, I think we've left a little bit out. So that's where I'd sort of push back on Richard's analysis a bit, or suggest an amplification of the cultural element. So in the 90s, the Dow Jones Index tripled. It was an up and to the right world, right? Everything, like going back to that comment about Obama, everything was sort of moving and going in the right direction. Australia was similar. You had even politics played to our sense that we could engineer appropriate balance. That's kind of the third way politics that were ascendant at that point. In short, we could manage it, right? We had the technical skills, and I think a manifestation of that in development was the MDGs. It was a very CEO, corner office. Here is the list. We're going to get it done. We can do it, team. Let's go. And we're going to keep going up and to the right. And we didn't understand contestation. Now, when I say we, I'm sort of broadly talking about the West. I know that's a somewhat problematic term, but I think it's useful in this way. But I think what another thing that I was prompted to do, just to end up on here and to just reinforce how I think this 90s mindset is really captivating us still. And I'd note, Richard, your list of achievements of Australian foreign policy, they're all 1990s achievements. You know, you could a realist would argue that's because that was when the moment of the international system allowed for middle power activism in that kind of way. I also kind of tend to think that the technical like sort of responses you're sort of suggesting is a little bit 1990s third way as well, perhaps. But look, I'm all for that. Unfortunately, I've become a centrist dad. You know, that's kind of what I think. But again, I think that emerges from the 1990s kind of mentality. But, you know, in 1990, the OECD had 20% of the world's population, so a fifth, but it represented more than 4/5 or 80% of the world's wealth. By the end of the 90s, that had changed a lot, but what we don't realise is the 2000s, that decade, was the fastest ever relocation of the world's economic centre of gravity in all of history by a mile. Things went from the centre of the Atlantic back to China with a rapidity that has never been seen, and we just didn't see it happening because we were you know, doing the MDGs and whatever else we were busy with. But you know, by 2030, OECD's countries will have a little less than a fifth of the world's population, but half of the wealth it had in 1990 comparatively, so 40% of the world's wealth. And that does translate to power and influence, so I think a lot of our development mentality, it sort of depends on this, and we've talked through it this morning about this kind of hierarchical world where the West can go up and to the right and can lead the rest of the world in that direction. But what we haven't realised in the meantime is that it should be almost flipped if we're going to use that same rationale.
Thanks, Ben. Jacqui, over the years I've seen you both agree furiously with Richard, but often you and I are on the same side of the table saying, hang on as well. So give it to us. What resonated with you from what Richard's saying, and what maybe surprised you or left you a little unconvinced?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I am by nature an optimist. I'm also the mother of teenage boys, and I thoroughly recommend that as a life survival skill, so I don't want to give it up. But I'm not optimistic about the way forward. I think the articulation of what's on the horizon is pretty stark. I think of all of them, climate change worries me the most. But in addition to sort of having these storm clouds, I think the other big issue we've got to grapple with is enormous unpredictability, uncertainty, not knowing how we're going to be able to, how we and others are going to navigate our way through these issues, or even how these storm clouds and the problems they bring are going to manifest in our lives and the lives of our regional partners. So I think it's both the negativity, but it's also the volatility that we have to grapple with. And maybe something that Richard said that really resonates with me is Australia's major foreign policy initiative is a single big bet. And in a time where you have multiple threats and a lot of uncertainty over how those threats are going to impact and how they're going to be navigated by other partners, I think having a single big bet strikes me as a really risky foreign policy position. I'm not a security expert. I don't understand AUKUS, but I certainly can see the space it takes up both from a fiscal and policy perspective. And I think we really need to dig into the opportunity cost of that in an environment where we do have these multiple threats and so much uncertainty ahead of us. So I think that's the main thing I want to say that I agree with. I do feel that Australia will need to be nimble, it will need to be agile, it will have to forge really deep alliances with other middle powers. I do think the US is not going to be we won't be able to navigate our way through by just relying on the US being our offensive posture. I think we're going to have to reach much more deeply into the institutions and partners in the region who have a similar interest in navigating these threats. Maybe one point of, I wouldn't call it dissonance, but I think is missing from Richard's analysis of where I think there are one of the problems we face in the way we think about development and foreign policy at the moment is we place a great importance on getting a seat at the table and being a partner of influence. And you can see this across the board. You can see it in the Pacific, where we absolutely want to be the partner of choice, and that's the language that's used. You can see it that we want to get a place on the Security Council. We want to host a COP, the COP31 conference. So we want Australia to have a seat at the table and to have influence. But I'm not convinced that's the most impactful way in which we will collectively navigate the threats ahead of us. The first thing I would say is Australia's not going to be able to navigate any of these threats on our own, and our domestic policy is largely about managing the symptoms, not addressing the root causes of these problems. So we do have to have a government that is very focused on dealing with the lived experience of people who are also victims of these major international threats or global threats, but we have to place a lot of effort on dealing with the root causes. My problem with the current focus on being the partner of choice and having a whole foreign policy that is about influence is that I think the greatest pathway to navigating those challenges is actually to strengthen the institutions and countries that have a similar objective of navigating those threats. And I think that is a very different way of thinking about how you use your foreign policy, your development influence. It's not about making Australia the most popular, it's actually about strengthening Indonesia's ability to navigate those threats and realising that if Indonesia is a really strong responsive, active partner in navigating those threats, then Australia benefits from that. I think we've reduced a lot of our focus to the relationships, not to the actual underlying strengthening of institutions and partners to navigate the threats that we have to collectively navigate, because we've got no chance of doing them without that.
Thanks, Jacqui. I'd really like to open up to the audience for a couple of questions and then come back to you, Richard. And I know I've got a few questions in my wings. So can I have a show of hands? We'll go number 1 here in the centre, 2, and then Jenny behind. We'll start here and then we'll move around. Are you all happy to take 3 questions and see where we go? Sorry to our amazing mic runners, I made you go as far as possible. Can you just pop your hand up? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Good day, I'm from Timor-Leste. There are 2 questions. One is the issue of Gaza, which plays pretty much the UN credibility at that stage right now. So UN has been playing major roles in terms of multilateralism. But now with such a situation, what the future of UN to drive that development agenda? Maybe if I may have, the questions, it used to be communism from the Western point of view, terrorism. And that's the drive of development and security and foreign policy. Now, from maybe the West or the liberal point of view, what is the biggest issue that drives this development agenda, foreign aid, foreign policy together? Thank you.
Thank you. Just pop your hand up, thanks.
Thank you. Question for all the speakers. Just the kind of reforms being talked about here required pretty large negative and positive shocks of like the early 20th century and then the fall of communism to create the space necessary. And to be honest, I'm not convinced the Trump presidency is actually on the same magnitude of a shock to create the space that we're talking about for the kind of really structural reforms to global institutions. It may be in a worst case scenario, but I think a central case of what a Trump presidency is not necessarily the same kind of scale of shock. And so what are some second and third order reforms that you would like to see in the meantime while maybe these shocks don't come about or maybe they're coming later?
Great question. Okay, so far we've got the issue of Gaza, the future of the UN, and what issues drive peace and development. We've then got, when it comes to Trump, it's just not the shock you think it is. What else is out there? Jenny, over to you, and then we'll come back to the panel.
So 60 years ago, Donald Horne wrote The Lucky Country, and his critique was different to your critique, but it was that same sort of searing critique it's been described as a call to arms. But it took Australia 20 years before we did anything about it. One of the things that allowed us to do something about it was the development of first University of Tasmania, but then at ANU, economics of small open economies to really understand the problems. So where do you see the new models and the new kind of, solutions that Australia could take forward as a small country or a middling power that then could be influential on those broader ways of doing things?
Super, super. Richard, should we come to you first? No, we're going to come to Richard. This happens all the time in our workplace. He says no all the time. We'll come to you last. And can I just put some people on notice? I'd love a youngster to ask a question. Certainly as somebody who's not quite of this age, I find this really, really confronting. So if somebody younger than me can offer us all up a bit of inspiration or a provocation, that would be amazing next. But Jacqui, I might kick off with you.
Yeah, they're hard questions. Maybe just on Gaza. I fully disclose my my status. So I'm on the chair of UNICEF Australia. I mean, if you look at the work that UNICEF has done in Gaza and the advocacy that UNICEF has, I think UNICEF has been a very powerful advocate, holding countries Israel to account, but also other countries in terms of how they have responded to Israel's aggression in Gaza. You can see that the multilateral institutions that are on the ground in places like that are really the only voice that is coming out and is resonating. So I think there's an incredibly important role of multilateral institutions in being the voice of decency and rights in a non-political way globally, and how much poorer we would be without those institutions, not just doing the incredible work that they do, but also being the advocates and the window into what is going on. So one of the challenges of multilateralism is, it can be incredibly inefficient. I think we're going to see an erosion of multilateralism with the Trump presidency. I think clearly they're going to be reducing expenditure through the so a lot less financial support. There'll be I hope there's not a retreat. I think one of the challenges for a country like Australia is you can't reform everything, but can you pick a few areas where you think multilateralism matters most and really double down and be a voice and an advocate for strengthening the multilateral system? I think Australia is very quiet on multilateralism. So that's one thing I think we absolutely have to do. Jenny, your point on where the next set of ideas are going to come from, I don't think they're going to come from within government, I have to say. I think, and that's not because there aren't a lot of incredibly smart, intelligent, thoughtful people within government, but they are just so busy. There is no time for reflection, consideration, policy development or advocacy. I feel like they're just sprinting the whole time, managing the political economy of working inside government. And that means, and I think that speaks to a bit the point Richard said about this hollowing out of the institutions of government, that their ability to actually think about the next generation of threats and big ideas and then develop research and evidence around it and then take that forward to cabinet and be able to convince the government to change its path is so eroded. So I think there's a real role for institutions and think tanks, universities in particular, to be able to really hone in on a few things and really have a campaign to try and progress changes in policy. I've spoken about this before, but I think a really good example of that is the work that ANU have done on Pacific migrant labour. That issue would not be where it is now without the consistent advocacy and evidence base that have been built through the ANU. And so, I mean, it is a great example of where foreign policy has changed. We've got really good, much more progressive and practical policy outcomes, but that would never have come from within government. So I think it's a challenge back on all of us. I think I need a little bit more time to think about the second and third order issues. I think it's a really, really good question. We are facing, I think, more of a slow burn rather than a dramatic explosion of issues, and that is in itself a risk, right? Unless Donald Trump or the Trump administration pulls out of AUKUS, that could be a foreign policy shock that would cause a big reset. But if it just remains, which I think it probably will, a highly risky, uncertain context, how do we force a decision out, a better reckoning about the risk of just going forward with that single bet? And what do we do in the absence of reconciling that? I don't have an answer for, but I think it's a really good question. So I've just completely dodged it because I don't have an answer. Yeah.
Ben, over to you.
Great. All right. Let me try and tackle those as well, starting with the Trump one. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think that the Trump presidency is going to open up that order-changing kind of space. And that's kind of almost kind of what I was getting at in terms of, you know, that Trump's return sort of means, I think, we stay in this sort of uncertain kind of outlook for longer than we may have. But you know, in terms of second or third order things, you know, thinking back, and I've been going back and being deliberate about trying to read about the origins of the Marshall Plan again, you know, because that was an obvious time where there was a chance to shape order, and you know, in a sense, establish the development order. And what has struck me in 2 points, I guess, that are a little more positive in terms of these ideas. Number one, George Kennan was asked by Marshall to write essentially what became the Marshall Plan, right? He wasn't a development person. I think that's kind of important. Or at least suggests that, you know, sometimes, you know, these reframing ideas need to come from outside, right? Like, and so, but the other thing that's really striking in all his writing about that and his analysis is that he didn't really consider this a geostrategic problem to be solved. He fundamentally thought it was a confidence problem. And I think there's parallels with our world as well in terms of confidence. And I think it's kind of the same point as being made this morning around trust. So I think that where there are partners, where there are opportunities to develop trust and confidence, and I don't mean just in security relationships or foreign policy. I really think like cultural confidence as well. And maybe that links us to the the Horn stuff, the Lucky Country stuff. Were you involved in? There was a couple of weeks back they had a retrospective. You went to that. I had a colleague who presented at that. We've been talking about. The book and also Coral Bell and how she was influenced was really quite interesting. But I don't have much to say more than that, other than to say I agree with your analysis. I think that's where Australia has to look in terms of where can we contribute in these niche areas. But in terms of the actual things to do, I'm at a loss. I mean, I kind of almost want to say the kind of there's some small businesses that are doing that can leverage up in the tech space, and solar as an example and that kind of thing. And I think that's kind of around about the area. But I don't know is my short answer there. On Israel and Gaza and the future of the UN. Again, harking back to this morning's, I think the big problem here is it manifests the hypocrisy of a lot of the actors that are involved, right? But if I'm being honest with you, I think that Ukraine is a bigger issue long term for the UN. I know that's not a common take, but that's my sense, and I think that's particularly around Security Council stuff will be more of the challenge in terms of looking forward.
Great. Over to you, Richard. Gaza, UN, and what are the bright ideas that'll save us?
Well, the counsel on the Trump shock is probably good counsel. You're probably right that it's not enough, although my view was not so much that this would remake the world order, and that suddenly, but it might cause Australia to rethink some of the things that it hasn't wanted to rethink. There are so many scenarios, but some of them are going to come into play fairly soon. President Xi is not a young man. President Trump is not a young man either. President Xi wants resolution of the Taiwan issue. You would expect he's going to force that in some shape or form in the next few years, very soon. And there's all sorts of ways that may play out. One of the wild cards is Donald Trump might do a deal with him. And if that were the case, well, that really would be a game changer in this part of the world. So, yeah, we certainly live in interesting times. I thought Jacqui's points earlier were on the money in terms of, we've got to deal with the changed world, and we've got to be working much more closely with our partners in entirely different arrangements, where we're playing a different role. And we could do that if we put our minds to it. It's by no means impossible. The strange thing for me is we just haven't had the ambition or the desire to do that. But it still is doable within the resources that we've currently got.
Great, we'll have a couple more questions. We'll go 1, 2 here, and maybe from this side of the room, anyone?
Thank you. I'll be the youth representative. And thanks for that representation. That was great. My name's Anna. Since it's provocative, and I really liked your opening, Richard, and the responses from the panellists, but I've heard recently a lot of talk about Australia having an identity crisis, not knowing who it is in the global order, who it wants to be in the region, How do you react to that? What can Australia do next to help take the way forward and figure out who Australia actually is? Thank you.
Great question. We've got just the guy for you, Anna. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Mosmi Bhim. I'm from Fiji. So probably a big question from a small country. Now we are having this world crisis. If you look at the situation in order, if you look at the international order, it's like people are saying it's about to fall apart. And we small countries, developing countries, we are supposed to look up to the Western world, you know. The Western world are supposed to be the leaders who are supposed to provide us guidance in terms of good governance policies to implement. And as you know, in Fiji, we've had coups and we've had to try to find ways to hold our leaders accountable. And Australia is probably one of our largest aid donors. And now they're the biggest donor to our military. So the next coup in Fiji will be funded by a military that has been trained by Australian aid. That's something to think about. So now that we are faced with this crisis, Donald Trump has been re-elected president. Biden has pardoned his own son, and Trump will ask his pending cases to be written off because you can't investigate a sitting president. And for us small island countries, it's the other way around. These large countries ask us for accountability. Now we have a president who served jail time for a treason-related offense. And now he's the president of our country. And we've been trying to tell our prime minister that's a bad decision. But now how can we say it's a bad decision when the United States president goes and pardons his own son? How do I hold our leaders accountable when the first world countries are setting such bad examples now, no? For example, yeah. So, and elections. 2026 we'll have another elections, and of course our elections will be observed by a multi-observer group who'll have to classify it free and fair. The United States election, Elon Musk, the world's richest man, was throwing money around. In our country, the first world countries would have classified our election as unfree, unfair, and full of bribery. So how come US election is still free and fair when Elon Musk openly threw millions of dollars around? What standards do we have left? Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a third question. Oh, thank you. Over here, Lucy.
Thanks. Lucy Pennington. I take your point, Richard, on how there hasn't been a lot of willingness to change in terms of Australia's place in the international order. So if I hand you, well, perhaps the four of you, a paper and a pen right now, but no additional funds further to what's currently in the international system, how would you redraw the international development ecosystem, and how would you place Australia on that piece of paper?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay. All right, so we'll go straight back down the line again, and I will just need to ask you to keep your answers a little bit short, so we've got a final wrap-up to go. But up first is Australia in an identity crisis? What can we do about it? How's it holding us back? The second question, of course, is really asking what is the ripple effect of Western decline, and frankly, how about the hypocrisy of it all? And thirdly, get your pens out. How would you redraw the ecosystem that we exist in now? Who would like to begin? I'm looking at you, Ben.
I'll begin so I don't have to do question 3.
Smooth, very smooth.
So Anna's question's a really good one, and this question about identity, and I really do think that we don't connect enough the question, who are we, as a fundamental way to understand our foreign policy. So who are we and how do we act in the world? And as with a lot of things in my life, I like to bring it back to cricket. And I know. Not the Australia-India one, the ball tampering in Cape Town, right? And I think it was I think it was very instructive. I was with teaching Australian foreign policy to a group of my students, and went in very upset that day, and they're like, what's going on? And I explained to them, and most of them said, the international students were like, yeah, we know. You guys are cheats and bullies. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's a bit of a mindset shift, and it was something, the way I remember it for myself is to go, who we are and who we tell ourselves we are is not the way we're perceived always, and you want those things to match up. So absolutely, and this does get to the hypocrisy stuff. It does touch on AUKUS. I know Alan Gingell, for example, was wary of AUKUS because what it suggested was we're going back to our great and powerful friends. It's more a reaction out of identity and a reaction out of fear instead of a who are we and who do we want to be response. So I think you're right. The only other sort of thing I would add to that, and going back to the 90s, is, and stemming from there, the emergence of social media, I think, is starting to create, it's just so much more difficult to get the coherence in terms of a national identity, right? So in COVID, there were studies that are really interesting showing that youth communities in Australia felt more affinity for youth communities overseas than, down the street. And so in an environment like that, I think it's very difficult to articulate a vision as a leader. And I think particularly in the Western world, we're seeing a lot of changeover in leadership because we're sort of cycling through, because it's very difficult to combine, these different these different isolated groups of individuals.
Super. Richard, I might come to you next.
Look, I totally agree with Ben on the identity issues, and on the ripple effect. Yeah, absolutely. How we conduct ourselves, what we do. It sets a standard for us, but it sets a standard for others as well. So we have to be cogent of that. Development reform. Okay. Well, I think for a start, if we were to work on common problems, that would give us a narrower agenda of things we can genuinely work together on in different ways. I'd like to see the end of the projectification of what we do. Of course you need to design things and you need inputs and da-da-da. You can't completely get away from that, but the model that we're using, it's very, very old, and really the problems we're trying to deal with now and the countries that we're dealing with, it's not working. And we've had a long time to conduct a reform program, a modernisation exercise, a deep dive to re-engineer this, and we haven't done it. One of the ways I think we could do that, we could say, look, the countries that we're increasingly dealing with in the region, they are these middle-income countries. They don't need service delivery. Poorer countries still need help with that, but these countries don't. They know what they want to do, and in basic service delivery, they can do it. But they've got lots of wicked problems they're grappling with. And we heard yesterday morning from Dr. Balzgan that he's crying out for expertise, responsive partners who can keep up with him and who can bring new ideas to the table. I've advocated for a decade that that's where we should be putting a huge amount of effort, and we should be a knowledge partner, very, very much focused on the problems of our partners. But I think increasingly we should be moving to common problems, because, not least because they're big, and we need to sell this to the public, and that is an easier sell. I think we should stop talking about our aid program. It's obsolete, it's condescending, you can't sell it. But we can sell international cooperation around these big challenges.
Thanks, Richard. And to you, Jacqui.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of points. Just on the Fiji issue, I think obviously countries around the world cannot rely on the standard that is set by the richest countries in the world as the path forward. I think we should just let that go. I do feel, although maybe we can show some bad examples that can be used, I hark back to the point that I think the power going forward is to strengthen the ability of countries like Fiji to navigate their own way through these issues rather than relying on a model of development from countries like Australia. And I use the example of climate change in the Pacific, right? Australia's had a terrible record on climate change reduction and adaptation. And I think the Pacific has stood up and been a voice on climate change against Australian policy for many years now, and has really been a powerful advocate on this globally because it's such an existential threat, not because of anything Australia did, right? And I think we've got to really dig into this and say how we manage an issue like climate change is not following Australia's lead, but by strengthening the ability of partners across the region to be advocates on the issues that we have joint concern around. So it's not dependent on a relationship with Australia to get traction on these issues, or Australia or other donor countries. I think it's an old-fashioned idea. But I do worry that the way we position the Australian aid program to have an intimate relationship is not putting effort into strengthening the capacity of countries and institutions to navigate these risks. And the best example I can use on this is things like civil society and the media. We will never be asked by countries in the region to put a really significant emphasis on supporting free media, civil society's voice, transparency, oversight, because that's not what government generally enjoys, right? So Australia doesn't put much in that because we put a premium on the relationship with the government. But in the long run, countries' ability to navigate coups, political pressure, corruption from external parties, climate change will all be dependent on having a nation state that has free and fair media and strong civil society. And that's where I think we need to pivot, is to really realise that investing in those fundamentals of strong countries and helping them navigate their way forward is the only sort of viable pathway.
Thanks, Jacqui. Well, look, we are almost at time, but Richard, I don't want to let you off the hook quite yet. And something that certainly many of us have observed of you over the years, and whenever I've travelled with you into the region, it's very evident as people who've worked with you over the last 30 or 40 years come up to you time and time again and thank you for the inspiration, the leadership, the prodding you've given them over the years. It's become evident that you have cultivated a number of careers. And so I wanted to just give you the opportunity now to speak not just to this room, but everybody who is listening to this live streamed and will see it on YouTube as well. What is the advice you would give to the young people and those of us that are going to be living this era over the next couple of decades? How do we navigate it? Over to you.
Well, the first piece of advice I would give would be to you, Bridie. I wish you'd raised that with me earlier. Because I could have given a better response. But I think I have tremendous hope that younger people coming through are going to remake the world in better ways. And that sounds a bit woolly-minded and a bit naive, but you can see enormous gender differences, age differences in policy responses to the problems that we're confronted with. And I'm certainly hopeful that young people will bring a bit of idealism and as well as the smarts to these jobs, and they will help us renew our thinking, our partnering, our approaches. And I actually see that a lot. So one of the things that keeps me going and inspires me is I spent a lot of time living in Manila. And it's a crazy place. I've been following it for 40 years, since my undergraduate days. And for 30 of those 40 years, not much was happening. development was proceeding very, very slowly. And it was a bit painful to watch. And Filipinos are lovely people, but Manila's not the greatest urban environment in the world. The last 10 years, and notwithstanding a few governance challenges still, President Duterte being the main one, I've seen enormous change. And I'm seeing it coming through all sorts of different vectors. I'm seeing good economic policy compounding over 12 or 15 years and suddenly making a difference. More money coming through, being better spent, flowing through the back blocks into sanitation for ordinary folk, roads that are better, housing that's improving, shanties that are being rebuilt in real time in front of me when I go for my walks, and it's just fabulous, it's inspiring, it can happen. And so my message is, let's keep at this, because we have made such extraordinary progress. And there's more to do, and there will always be more to do. And it's young people who have to forget the cynicism, create new ways of doing things, and achieve better results in the future.
Well, if everybody could join with me in thanking Richard Moore, Ben Day, and of course, Jacqui de Lacy. Thank you all so much, Richard. Keep on thinking and provoking. We hope to see you again soon. A message from Cam is we will have a short break and be back for the forecasting panel in here thereafter. Thank you.